Rock and roll used to be the gnarliest, heaviest genre in town. A genre that embodied rebellion, fast cars, and the loudest guitars that late 1950s music had to offer. But as the 60s wore on, coffee and rebellion seemed positively childish. Popular music needed something harder and more in sync with the sex and drugs part of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Enter psychedelic rock. Similar to good old rock and roll, but with mind-expanding themes and an intense interest in a girl called Lucy, who was in the sky with diamonds. But the summer of love came and went. The Vietnam War didn't end, and the Manson murders made it so that the positivity of the movement seemed blind. A darker sound was needed, and appeared in the form of metal. The bastard child of rock and roll and psychedelic rock, metal was harder, heavier, and louder than anything before, and became one of the most important genres of all time. But how did we get there? What were the steps along the way, the key tracks and influences? And how did we get from Johnny B. Good to Black Sabbath in 12 years? This is how psychedelic rock became metal. Do you need a website for your band? Do you want to improve yourself by learning new skills? Do you want to feel safe while using public Wi-Fi? Well, I've got something way better. Raid Shadow Legends. Yeah, that's right, Raid Shadow Legends. By now, you know what's up. It's the free-to-play dark fantasy RPG that has sponsored every YouTube video you've watched in the last 6 months. But with all that exposure, have you actually played the game? Raid is available to play on Apple, Android, and desktop. It even has cross-device functionality, so you can switch between different platforms with the same account without losing any progress. There's basically no excuse. They got me hooked, they'll get you sooner or later.
Raid Shadow Legends.
What I like about Raid is I'm able to choose between dozens of upgradable champions to make my own unique team, meaning I can swap out members at will and change up my strategy. Plus, there's an intense story-driven campaign, dungeon runs, and even high-stakes player versus player battles. It's all there. Does Raid sound like the game for you? Why not download and try it now? Click the link in the description below, and if you're a new player, you will get 100,000 silver. But wait, there's more. Well, how about getting the free champion, the Dark Elf Hexweaver? All of this will be waiting for you in the next 30 days. Do not delay. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. The origin of metal, if you want to go all the way back, starts sometime in the 1950s with Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Chuck Berry. These men are the beginnings of guitar-based rock and roll, so 1955's Maybelline by Berry is a good starting point as any, as it combined country and western licks with an R&B template.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh Maybelline, why can't you be true?
It also featured Berry's electric guitar as a showy lead instrument, which previously had been mostly relegated to rhythm, which he then further refined by the release of 1958's Johnny B. Good. Berry inspired pretty much all guitar-based music forever after, but some immediate converts were Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and for proto-metal purposes, Eddie Cochran. The latter's singles, Summertime Blues and Come On Everybody, continued Berry's evolution of the electric guitar, experimenting with distortion and multi-tracking.
But there ain't no cure for the summertime blues.
His stuttering guitar motif, an original idea that British invasion bands would leap on. As such, in 1958, his rebellious anthems were the heaviest thing you could hear on the radio.
Hey, look at that!
But that was mostly down to the actual heavier sound of 1958, being Rumble by Link Wray. By slicing his amp speaker cone and playing extremely loud, Ray was able to create a song so distorted, feedback drenched, and raucous that despite having no lyrics, it was banned from US radio due to its deemed potential to incite juvenile delinquency. Inspired in part by Ray and a need to push what a guitar could do to its limits. In 1962, king of surf rock, Dick Dale released Misirlou. Legend has it that during a performance, Dale was bet by a young fan that he could not play a song with only one string of his guitar, remembering an old Middle Eastern folk song that his uncle used to play on a single string of an oud. Dale took this and turbocharged the tempo to make it rock and roll. The result is a song that seriously shreds, way before there were songs that shredded. During this time, inspired by Johnny B. Good's tale of rock and roll success and everything since, teenagers across the US formed garage rock bands in an attempt to try it for themselves, playing a rudimentary chord-heavy version of rock and roll. One of the early successes was The Kingsmen, with their incomprehensible classic, Louie Louie, which peaked at number 2 in the Billboard chart. On the other side of the Atlantic, the British invasion bands were creating their own spin on rock and roll, with the heavily distorted ka-chunk of the Kinks' You Really Got Me from 1964 being the first point where you could dub a track proto-metal. The Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction and The Who's Substitute would arrive the next year, continuing the race to see who could make a song so heavy it was no longer rock. Psychedelic rock existed in part before the 13th Floor Elevators, whether it be in the droning guitar of the Beatles' Ticket to Ride, or the Yardbirds' Heart Full of Soul, or the acid rock of Grateful Dead, but never had it been as unflinchingly gnarly as on the Elevators' 1966 debut single, You're Gonna Miss Me. It was not necessarily heavier, but with its references and consumption of psychedelic drugs, it definitely was heavy, man. And compared to the Elevators' Rory Erickson, the Beatles and Yardbirds were merely day trippers. With the velocity of Erickson's Little Richard-style wail, healthy implementation of the electric jug, and driving chunky riffage, You're Gonna Miss Me proved that psychedelic rock could be much more than acoustic sing-alongs. It could hit you hard and in a concise manner. The electric jug, an invention of the band's Tommy Hall, was used to aid in evoking the mind-altering experience of LSD, an attempt to put acid into the song. Despite never properly breaking through, the band would influence a whole generation of proto-punks and put a harder-edged version of psychedelic rock on the map. By 1966, British invasion bands like the Beatles, The Who and the Rolling Stones were turning to psychedelia. The Beatles having released Rubber Soul the year before with its trippy experimentation on tracks like Norwegian Wood. The rest were playing catch-up. Musically, the Rolling Stones' Paint It Black has very little to do with what metal would become, but in 1966, its lyrical bleakness was a counterpoint to the sunny optimism of their fellow psychedelic bands. Amid Brian Jones' superior sitar melody and Charlie Watts' tribal drums, Mick Jagger outlines a tale of utter hopelessness.
I look inside myself and see my heart is black.
Jagger has said, it's the beginnings of miserable psychedelia. That's what the Rolling Stones started. The song and its lyrical themes would become associated with the Vietnam War, which in turn would bleed into the darker, heavier music that would appear near the end of the decade. Out of the British invasion bands, The Who were the loudest, heaviest band around. As early as 1965's My Generation, they were implementing riotous drums, bass solos, and distortion to thrilling effect. Helping the process was a bigger, louder wall of Marshall amps approach that pushed The Who's sheer volume to the limits of 60s PA systems. In 1967, The Who released I Can See for Miles, one of their few delves into psychedelia proper. Despite having dreamy 3-part harmonies and a mind-stretching chorus, it was not the hit that guitarist Pete Townshend had assumed, reaching only number 10 in the UK charts. To me, it was the ultimate Who record, yet it didn't sell. I spat on the British record buyer. One reviewer for its parent album, The Who Sells Out, stated that the track was the heaviest he'd ever heard. This would be the spark and challenge for another British invasion band to try and outdo them. But that's later. First. In 1966, Jimi Hendrix was an unknown, playing to handfuls of dazzled fans in New York basements, getting by as a session musician for acts like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. On the 22nd of September, he moved to London, financed by his new manager, The Animals' Chas Chandler. Hendrix's version of Electric Blues made him an instant hit with England's rock royalty, whereas British rock musicians were trying to ape American blues. What Hendrix brought to his psychedelic sound was a love of jazz, which aided his improvisational live style, and an appreciation for the classical greats, expanding his sound further. Joined by drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding, they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Link Wray and The Who had been experimenting with distortion beforehand, but nothing at that point had sounded as downright intimidating as the opening stuttering, overdriven riff of Purple Haze. By the song's shit-hot solo, the band had reached another plane of existence. The Experience's next release, Axis Bold as Love, would feature If 6 Were 9, not only a denouncement of 1967's Summer of Love and its hippie-ish do-nothingism, further predicting the cultural darkness to come, but Mitchell's start-stop style would inspire Black Sabbath on War Pigs. Hendrix would inspire every soloist since, but particularly Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and later Eddie Van Halen. His impact on metal cannot be understated. Before Hendrix came to the London scene, his inarguable guitar hero was Cream's Eric Clapton. Cream had released their debut in '66, the blues rock inspired Fresh Cream. But Hendrix's arrival energized the band to more psychedelic heights. 1967's Sunshine of Your Love was bassist Jack Bruce's attempt to write in his style.
I've been waiting so long.
He played this gig that was blinding. I don't think Jack had really taken him in before. But when he did see it that night, after the gig he went home and came up with the riff. It was strictly a dedication to Jimmy. And then we wrote a song on top of it. Unaware that it was a tribute to him, Hendrix covered the song live on many occasions in an accelerated instrumental form. One particular take delayed the BBC One news by a couple of minutes after Hendrix stopped midway through playing Hey Joe and dedicated his version to the recently defunct Cream.
We'll have to stop playing this rubbish and dedicate a song to the Cream.
Sunshine of Your Love's parent album, Disraeli Gears, also features Tales of Brave Ulysses, with Clapton's heavy soloing. And sword and sorcery lyricism.
Her name is Aphrodite, and she rides a crimson shell.
Both were elements that would be retained and expanded on within the metal of Led Zeppelin, Iron Maiden, and many others. Despite this, some of the band have been less than happy about their supposed children. Said drummer Ginger Baker, "People say Cream gave birth to heavy metal. If that's so, we should have had an abortion." At the same time in the US, psychedelic rock bands were creating their own beautifully distorted noise. New York's Vanilla Fudge made a name for themselves by producing hard-rocking versions of pop songs. Their epic 1967 reinterpretation of The Supremes' You Keep Me Hanging On was a particular highlight. We used to slow songs down and listen to the lyrics and try to emulate what the lyrics were dictating. That one was a hurting song. It had a lot of emotion in it. If you listen to Hanging On Fast by The Supremes, it sounds very happy, but the lyrics aren't happy at all. But their impact on metal wasn't just by rocking the shit out of Motown hits. When Led Zeppelin first toured the United States, it was in support of Vanilla Fudge. In the psychedelic boomtown of San Francisco, amongst Jefferson Airplane and Janis Joplin, Blue Cheer were also trying their hand at metallifying classic songs. In this case, Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues.
Oh, there ain't no cure for the summertime blues.
Inspired by the heft of Hendrix's set at the Monterey Pop Festival, Blue Cheer were the point where psychedelic rock morphs into something that can be recognized as metal. Distorted, loud, and deep in the low end.
But Lord, I tried to call my baby, I tried to get a date.
Other musicians in the Frisco scene, though, weren't into the sheer volume of Blue Cheer's sound. People just thought we were making noise. They thought we were a detriment to the scene. I remember Mike Bloomfield came up to me and he says, "You can't do that." I said, "Come on Mike, you can do it too. All you gotta do is turn this knob up to 10. Released in January 1968, it is one of the first properly heavy sounding songs to make it onto the pop charts, beating the other main contenders for first metal song by months. That said, it didn't have a name yet. In May 1968, a review of the Electric Flags, A Long Time Coming, had the first mention of heavy metal in relation to music. This is the new soul music, the synthesis of white blues and heavy metal rock. But despite having a track called Killing Floor, the Electric Flag were not heavy metal. The Los Angeles-based Steppenwolf have a more valid claim with 1968's Born to Be Wild. Originally written by songwriter Mars Bonfire and intended to be a folk ballad, Steppenwolf got hold of it, cranked up the tempo, and added some driving, hard-rocking riffs. Its verse features the line,
I like smoking lightning, heavy metal thunder.
but rather than the music, Bonfire was referring to his new Ford Falcon. But because of its use in Easy Rider, the song forever linked motorcycle culture with heavy metal. But the track's message of freedom and optimism was antithetical to the bleakness of the emerging metal genre. Also in 1968, San Diego's Iron Butterfly were perfecting that darker tone with the 17-minute long doom-led In-A-Gadda Da Vida and its ghoulish, pounding organ. Sonically, it embodied the growing darkness of the 60s, post-Summer of Love. That song was only about a minute and a half long when it started. That song took on a life of its own. It just kept going and going. The engineer just left the tape rolling. The producer wasn't even there when we recorded it. Despite its garbled title, In-A-Gadda Da Vida was a definite move forward in the newborn genre. Its length, musicianship, and killer riff would be taken on by the next generation of bands. Everyone from Black Sabbath to Slayer were clearly fans. While recording the disjointed yet masterful White Album, the Beatles' Paul McCartney decided that he didn't want to be known as the soppy ballad writer anymore, dusted off his Little Richard Holler, and wrote Helter Skelter as a means to outdo The Who. The track features some of the dirtiest chugging riffs and heaviest drums of any track available in 1968, performed by the guy who wrote Yesterday. The Beatles recorded the song as an extended jam for hours on end, playing harder with each successive take. By the end of take 18, the one on the record, Ringo hurled his sticks across the studio in frustration and unleashed his iconic outburst.
I got blisters on my fingers!
As well as making proto-metal that little bit heavier, the song would also, unfortunately, make the end of the 60s a fair bit darker. Supposedly, Charles Manson interpreted visions of racial violence and spawned his cult after hearing Helter Skelter's jagged textures. Also out in 1968 was the Pretty Things' SF Sorrow, one of the first rock operas, and depending on who you ask, it was either an influence on The Who's Tommy or had nothing to do with it. On this grab bag of London-based psych rock was the single Defecting Grey. It was not a hit, but amid the usual acid rock weirdness, it has moments of metal heaviness and musicianship in line with the rest of proto-metalers in 1968. But this heavier metal sound was getting to be such a prevalent trend in rock music that even the Turtles of Happy Together fame were trying their hand at their own brand of heaviness on Buzzsaw. 1968 was also the year that Deep Purple formed. Their rocking cover of Joe South's Hush the same year was a significant US hit, inspired in part by Vanilla Fudge. It wouldn't be until 1970 with Deep Purple Mark II, the introduction of vocalist Ian Gillan, and their In Rock album, where they would have a truly far-reaching impact on metal. But Deep Purple were not the only British hard rock band that had to evolve beyond their original form to become truly essential. Since 1963, the Yardbirds had been experimenting within blues rock and psychedelia with varying levels of success. Their first lead guitarist had been Eric Clapton, who left to form Cream after recording the lightweight For Your Love because he felt the single was beneath him. He was replaced with Jeff Beck. When he left in 1966, some guy called Jimmy Page stepped in and recorded on the band's final 60s album, Little Games. But when the rest of the Yardbirds left, Page had some Scandinavian tour dates he was contracted to play, and so he hired some replacements. John Paul Jones on bass, Robert Plant to sing, and John Bonham on drums. For the shortest time, they were known as the New Yardbirds, but before long, they changed it to Led Zeppelin. Released at the start of 1969, their debut was a chest-beating, fist-pumping mix of the hardest blues rock and psychedelic experimentation. Closing side A is Dazed and Confused, a track heavily inspired by the Jake Holmes song of the same name.
I'm dazed and confused.
For so long, it's not true.
That Page had played as an extended jam live during his tenure in the Yardbirds. It's heavy, but in a different way to the blunt heaviness of Blue Cheer or Helter Skelter. Instead of distorted as fuck shouting and noise, Dazed and Confused is restrained, uses sonic light and shade, and is perfectly paced, so that when that freak out hits, it hits hard. By their second album, Led Zeppelin were writing experimental yet bone-crushing assaults like Whole Lotta Love. You know that scene in Apocalypse Now where the American soldiers fly into battle, musically accompanied by Wagner? Well, in 1970, what they were actually using was Whole Lotta Love. It's a terrifying image. Bloodthirsty, heavily armed children fueling themselves with the heaviest, most violent music available. But it's oddly exhilarating too, and that's the genius of the song. Zeppelin turned teenage sex drive into apocalyptic, precision-tooled violence. And because of them, heavy music would not be the same again. As well as Led Zeppelin's debut and follow-up, in 1969 other bands were stretching the boundaries of the nascent metal genre. In October, King Crimson erupted onto the scene with the psychedelic prog of their first album, In the Court of the Crimson King. The first song on that album, 21st Century Schizoid Man, is a 7-minute hellstorm of gonzo guitar, shifting meters, and nasty sax. Admittedly, the saxophone is not an instrument that metal as a whole would take to heart, but when combined with Robert Fripp's Mondo guitar riff, it sounds like little else. It's jazz-style time-fuckery also expanded on what Hendrix had started previously, setting up Rush, Yes, and much later Tool, Mastodon, and Porcupine Tree. The proto-metal proggery from 1969 was also present in Pink Floyd. While they are a band mostly considered on the heaviness scale as somewhere between rock and hard rock, their live take on B-side Careful with the Axe Eugene from Ummagumma features a scream from Roger Waters that is so anguished and sustained that it must have galvanized at least one metal vocalist, be it Rob Halford, Bruce Dickinson, or any number of thrash metalers. While their music was a less heavy version of blues-influenced psychedelic rock,
Wicked woman, you go to hell.
Chicago's Coven influenced metal thematically with their 1969 album, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. It was the first rock album that's music features references to the sign of the horns, inverted crosses, and the phrase, Hail Satan.
Hail Satan! Hail Satan!
Unlike later bands that used these symbols, they weren't for merely shock value or because metal. These were frontwoman Jinx Dawson's genuine beliefs, steeped in family tradition. Also, coincidentally, the first track on their album is called Black Sabbath. In February 1970, Birmingham's Black Sabbath released their self-titled debut, and from that moment, metal had an inarguable year dot. While you can discuss either way on what came before, from the atmospheric doom metal introduction of their title track, Black Sabbath were most definitely metal. Flavoured by the industrial home city, their ultra-heavy sound was developed by accident. While doing sheet metal work, a cutter had come down on guitarist Tony Iommi's middle and ring fingers and sliced the ends off. He was able to continue to play by tuning down his guitar strings, and wore fake plastic fingertips made out of a melted down fairy liquid bottle, so he was able to grip easier. This gave a deeper, more ominous tone to his monolithic guitar work. This combined with John Ozzy Osbourne's pain vocals to create a sound unlike anyone else. With their sound, they summed up the end of the Love generation, the one soured by the war in Vietnam, the Manson family, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. These were dark times. Black Sabbath and metal met this with darker music. Alongside them, Deep Purple, Sir Lord Baltimore, Humble Pie, Uriah Heep, Captain Beyond, Budgie, and many others were making similarly metallic noises, inspiring the next generations and subgenres to come. Even today, metal still lives on, its followers bountiful, and new bands still taking the genre to strange new places. Metal is still the heaviest, gnarliest music in town. And to think, without Johnny B. Good, we might not have gotten here. Thanks for watching. Who do you think is keeping metal alive in 2020? Anyway, did you like it? Why not like, comment and subscribe? If you really did like it and all the other stuff I'm doing, why not check out my Patreon? It's got cool rewards for cool people. I'd like to thank my new top tier member, Dylan Heerfees. Thanks a bunch, it really does help, and I'll see you next time.